back in episode 129, The History of St. Olaf, I mentioned how the Heimskringla mentions a pair of Icelandic customs which went against Christian practice: abortion and eating horse meat. The Christian condemnation of abortion is pretty obvious. The whole thing about not committing murder, and prohibitions against abortion can be traced back to the earliest days of the church. But horse meat? That one was a bit puzzling. Seems like an odd thing to ban. So, I've taken a deeper look, and sure enough, the Catholic Church did ban eating horses. The history of that ban, next on Catholic History Trek.
God bless America.
God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you. They will be the concluding words on each broadcast.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president.
Annuncio optis gaudium magnum. Habemus papam.
You've embarked on a Catholic history trek.
The Jews had many dietary restrictions, such as those described in Leviticus chapter 11, but those were eliminated for the Catholic Church by the first pope, St. Peter. As recorded in the 10th chapter of Acts of the Apostles, he had a vision of a sheet filled with food descending from heaven, and a voice instructed Peter not to call unclean the foods which God now had made clean. This vision occurred right before the men from the centurion Cornelius arrived at Peter's home in Joppa, thus opening the way for Gentile converts who were no longer bound by the Jewish dietary laws. Given the church's openness to eating previously taboo foods, why would horse meat be banned? Was horse meat one of the foods not in St. Peter's vision? Was the church at odds with the Horse Meat Packers Union? Was horse meat toxic, more prone to sickness and disease than other meats? Was there a shortage of horses, compelling the church to take steps to preserve them? The answer to all these questions is no. The most authoritative evidence of the church banning horse meat is likely found in the 8th century correspondence between St. Boniface and Pope Gregory. Boniface, an English Benedictine monk, was sent by Gregory II to Germany to evangelize the pagans and reform the church. Today, we have copies of this correspondence between Boniface and Gregory II and his successor, Gregory III, which gives us a glimpse into the life and faith of the church in the 8th century. In a letter from Gregory III to Boniface in 732, which named Boniface a bishop, Pope Gregory advised him on the sacrament of baptism. Baptize any person who was unsure if they were baptized, rebaptize any who had not been baptized in the Trinity, or had been baptized by a priest who is sacrificing to Jupiter and partaking of pagan sacrifices, and a baptismal record must be kept. Regarding purgatory, the Pope explained the teaching of the Church was, every man should make offerings for those who die as Christians. The priest should offer Mass for them, but if the person died in sin, the priest was forbidden to offer the Mass. The Pope also advised Boniface to implement a serious penance for murder. The penitent was to be barred from the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, except to the point of death, was to abstain from meat and wine for the rest of their life, and it was to fast every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Boniface also condemned the practice of German converts who would sell their slaves to be sacrificed by the heathens. He instructed a penance similar to the one for murder should be imposed upon those slave masters. The Pope invested Boniface in the pallium, but explained he was to only wear it during the celebration of Mass and in consecrating a bishop. See episode 132 for more on palliums and other vestments. Regarding our episode on horse meat, the Pope said this: "You say, among other things, that some eat wild horses and many eat tame horses. By no means allow this to happen in the future, but suppress it in every possible way with the help of Christ, and impose a suitable penance upon offenders. It is a filthy and abominable custom." An abominable custom? Crazy as that may sound, a similar ban can also be found in Ireland. Horse meat is mentioned in an Irish compilation of canon laws from the 7th or 8th century. Among the canons are the penances to be imposed for various sins. There were several penances for severe sins, like fasting on bread and water for a period of 12 years for procuring an abortion, and fasting on bread and water 7 years for any other homicide. And there were small penances for small sins, like eating the wrong food. For example, if one ate a dead carcass or ate food which dogs had been eating from, they were to fast on bread and water 40 days. Although, if that carcass was a mouse, the fast was only 7 days. For eating horse meat, the penance was 4 years on bread and water, meaning the penalty was much closer to homicide than eating the wrong food. There was clearly something about eating horses that went beyond other dietary faux pas. The difference was paganism. Unlike cows, pigs, and other animals commonly eaten as food, horses were only eaten in pagan religious ceremonies. As Christians spread to these lands, the suppression of eating horse meat was an attempt to stamp out these pagan rituals and, by association, to eliminate the worship of the pagan gods. The effects of this ban can be seen throughout Northern Europe. Oxford University's Journal of Archaeology and other scholarly works have documented research on medieval horse bones. Basically, the age of the animals at their death, the location of their burial, and whether they had the telltale marks of having been scratched by knives cutting chunks of flesh off the bone. The data showed eating horse meat was widespread in Northern Europe and England before the 8th century, but essentially disappeared afterward. In Scandinavia, the pagan practice of sacrificing and eating horses continued at least until the early 11th century, when it was condemned by St. Olaf. Episode 129. One interesting tale from the Heimskringla illustrates the strong bond between the pagan Norwegians and their sacrificial consumption of horse meat. The Heimskringla, which I heavily referenced for the life of St. Olaf, documents the saga of King Hakon the Good, who reigned about 50 years before the saint. Hakon had been baptized a Christian, but unlike Olaf, who ardently spread the religion through his domains, Hakon seems to have kept his Christianity close to the vest, to not arouse unrest among his pagan subjects. As the Heimskringla recounts, at a harvest festival in Trondheim, the men brought ale, cattle, and horses. The animals were slaughtered and their blood sprinkled on the men, and on the pagan temple where the animal flesh was being boiled. At these pagan ceremonies, it was Hakon's custom to eat alone, or with a few close men, possibly to avoid stirring discontent among the people for not partaking in their rites. But on this occasion, the people insisted he take the high seat and sit with them. Of the sacrificial cup, Earl Sigurd blessed it in the name of Odin and drank of it. But when he offered it to the king, Hakon then made the sign of the cross over the cup before drinking it. This act caused a ruckus among the men, before Sigurd's quick thinking convinced them that the king had merely blessed the cup with a symbol of Thor's hammer. On the next day of the festival, the boiled meat was to be consumed. Again, the men insisted the king sit with them and eat the sacrificial horse meat with them. But Hakon refused to eat the meat. So they asked that he at least drink of the soup which contained the meat. But again, Hakon refused. So they asked that he at least taste of the gravy. But again, Hakon refused. Before the discontented crowd could lay hands upon the king, Earl Sigurd came up with a compromise. He proposed the king simply put his mouth to the handle of the kettle, upon which the greasy steam of the boiled horse meat had settled. The king relented and did this, but only after placing a linen cloth over the handle. This concession apparently did not satisfy the crowd. This episode with the king, if nothing else, shows how connected the people were with their pagan rituals, and how offended they were by the king's refusal to partake of them. But it also shows how seriously Catholics used to take their fasting, and how resolute Hakon the Good was in avoiding any stain of the sin of idolatry against God. Interestingly, also in Trondheim, at the Archbishop's Palace, of all places, archaeologists have found remains of horse bones with cut marks, indicating meat had been cut off. A diocese, and later an archdiocese, it would seem perhaps one of her 24 bishops was unable to resist this pagan delicacy, although, to be fair, it's unknown what the circumstances were, or who actually consumed the horse meat. With the spread of Protestantism in the 16th century, the Christian influence of the Catholic Church on Scandinavian laws and culture waned, as it did throughout many other parts of Europe. Coupled with this loss of faith was an increase in eating horse meat. Although this increase was minimal, as they remained primarily animals for work and war, and they were never consumed anywhere near the levels of those animals raised specifically for food. While evidence of this Catholic ban on horse meat is mostly centered around Northern Europe, its effects spanned as far away as China. And I need to thank one of Kevin's friends for alerting me to this bit of history. The missionary travels of Jesuit priest Matthew Ricci took him to China in 1583, where he would spend the final 27 years of his life. This apostle of China was honored by the Chinese and their emperor as the wise man from the West, due to his contributions to Chinese developments in math and science, introducing them to Western advancements in these fields. Several books have documented his missionary work, including Vincent Cronin's 2016, The Wise Man from the West, in which we find Ricci's encounter with a sect called the Adorers of the Cross. These Adorers were a remnant of a once thriving Christian community descended from Eastern Christians who had come to China 5 centuries earlier with the Mongols. Disconnected from Christianity for half a millennium, these Adorers only retained 2 vestiges of the faith, according to Ricci. They made the sign of the cross before they ate, and they did not eat the flesh of horses or mules. This rejection of horse meat was described as evidence for the European origin of those who had originally evangelized these Adorers, which makes sense as the Christian prohibition against it originated in Europe, where horse meat consumption was connected to paganism. It is interesting this ban on horse meat was one of only 2 aspects of the Christian faith to survive 5 centuries, although Ricci describes the neighboring Jews and Muslims having their own dietary restrictions, so it may have lasted as nothing more than their version of these fasts, whose origin had been long lost. Today, horse meat is rarely consumed outside of countries like Japan, Italy, or France, where it is considered a delicacy, a leaner, higher protein option to beef. There are several reasons why it is not a staple in Western diets. For one, horses are seen more as pets than food. For example, some young girls play with My Little Pony or other horse dolls, but there is a reason no toy company markets My Little Cow or My Little Pig. Another reason for the lack of horse meat in typical diets is due to the medications often given to horses, which are not approved for human consumption. For example, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug phenylbutazone is toxic to humans. Many horses are rejected by slaughterhouses if they have these drugs in their system. In St. Olaf's, Norway, there were less than 100 horses butchered for food last year, which was barely 1% of the 9,000 horses eaten just 70 years earlier. And in the United States, the same precipitous decline can be seen. In the 1980s, over 300,000 horses were processed annually at 16 federally inspected processing plants. But by 2007, that number dropped to 0 after the U.S. Congress passed a law cutting funds for federal inspections of these plants. The ban was lifted in 2011, although Congress did not allocate any funding for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to resume the inspections. In an unrelated but interesting horse meat story from a decade ago, a European supplier of meat for several fast food chains in the United Kingdom, including Taco Bell, was found to be selling them horse meat. After a public outcry, the practice was ended, but not before American Taco Bell locations got branded for selling horse meat, even though the horse meat never made it across the pond. It's long been wondered what kind of meat Taco Bell, McDonald's, and many other fast food chains use in their products. Whatever it is, apparently it's not horse meat. Actually, according to Taco Bell, their beef is beef, but filled with additives like caramel color, Tarula yeast, sodium phosphates, and soy lecithin. A final consideration for this ban on horse meat is the teaching of St. Paul as recorded in his first epistle to the Corinthians. Paul acknowledges there is nothing inherently wrong in eating meat offered in pagan rites, so long as one recognizes the pagan deities are false gods and their sacrifices empty. Despite this, Paul still made sure to entirely fast from the food. Many saints and theologians have explained his actions. St. Clement of Alexandria, Anselm, Theophylact, Cornelius a Lapide, and George Leo Haydock among some. They all explained that the meat offered to the idols could be eaten, but it was necessary to avoid doing so, because it would cause scandal for the weak or misguided. And so it was with horse meat. Aside from horses injected with toxic drugs, there's nothing inherently wrong with eating My Little Pony, the horse, not the toy. But to break away from the pagan practices and ultimately from the pagan deities, it was deemed of utmost importance for the Christians to avoid eating it. But one practice you do not need to avoid is subscribing to Catholic History Trek. In fact, I would dare say it's even encouraged. And instead of sharing a sort of beef taco from Taco Bell with a friend, why not share our podcast with them? We guarantee to be free of phosphates, butylated hydroxytoluene, nitrates, and artificial fillers. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.